It's a great pleasure to be here, and we've been working for the last few days with some student groups, and it's quite exciting to see how many energy and how many ideas there are here. What I'm going to talk about here this afternoon is more or less the organization Wonderland, Platform for European Architecture, that you may be interested in because we're planning some events next year here in Kiev, but also we're as a network of architecture offices and architecture groups. We're also welcoming participants or members from Kiev. So if you have any questions or any suggestions about that, you have at the end of the presentation our contact information. So just briefly, my name is Levente Polyak. I'm from Budapest, but I work in Vienna with Wonderland. First of all, I would just describe a little bit Wonderland. What is Wonderland? It is, as I said, a platform for European architecture, basically a loose network of different kinds of practices or groups or organizations dealing with architecture. And I'll get back to this later because we tend to expand the notion or the definition of architecture a little bit, but I'll tell you later why we think in this way. So we have at the moment 95 member teams, which is quite a big network. We're active in 16 European countries, but there's place for more. So Ukraine and Kiev is welcome. And we're cooperating with a lot of major European architecture organizations like NIE, the Architekturzentrum Wien, Cité de l'Architecture in Paris, and many others. Just a few little details about our activities and our past. So the organization was founded in 2002 in Austria, and since then there's been periods where different kind of activities were relevant for us. We did a few touring exhibitions so far, magazines, we published a few books, and we run different kinds of events, and I'm gonna talk about this a little bit in details. And something that's also interesting for us is that this year we are celebrating our 11th anniversary with a big event series that I'll tell you more about later. So these are the major projects we have nowadays in our repertoire, and I'll get to explain them one by one. So this is under construction, which is based on the idea that as architects or design professionals, we have to deal with regulations a lot. So we led a series of workshops looking at what are the regulations which are working fine at the moment, what are the regulations which are meaning serious obstacles for us, for the design professions, for planning, and in general, how to deal with regulations from an architectural design viewpoint. How can we, let's say, play with the regulations? How can we push towards a change of regulations? So in general, defining attitudes towards regulations. Another kind of event we've been organizing in the past few years is called Blind Date, which refers to an event where two design teams are meeting along one topic. The topic can be, like we hear, like what is the minimum of planning with there, or placemaking as a planning tool, or sustainability on all levels, social coherence, vacancy, post-shopping. So there's the two design teams that may have not known each other before. They meet in a public situation, and it's also a practice of how to introduce your practice, how to find common points, and also how to create a dialogue around one topic in a public situation. And there's another thing we're really trying to promote with Wonderland, and also with the partner organizations we have, is Movies in Wonderland, which is a series of screenings and festivals all across Europe in architectural themes. Those of you who were present in the past days, in the evenings, in the end of the workshops, each day we presented some films. And it was a great pleasure to see the students, how revealing and how inspiring some of those movies may be, because we all believe that cinema or video, so the moving image, is a very good vehicle to communicate about architecture. And also it's quite important for us to to collect films that we can show in the public, so in public spaces, in the public domain. Because again, we think that the cinema, to think about cinema or think about the projection as a catalyzing event can be very helpful to redynamize, revitalize public spaces. So just a few examples we did 3 years ago at the Venice Biennial in Venice. Is the culture center called Marion, where we organized a screening, or last year in Linz at the Tabakfabrik, again, like a very exciting space, or just a few months ago in Budapest, it was in particular very interesting because we showed a film about different kinds of subway systems in the world, and we showed this in some new in a new subway station that is not open yet to the public. So there were a lot of people willing to come down to see the station and to see in the station a film about all these subway lines. So it was a site-specific projection which drew a lot of people there. And again, we think that these kinds of events can, change our perception of architecture. Also, the new places can be inaugurated or branded with these kinds of events that we attach to them. Yes, and we also do screenings in very regular places like cinemas. I mentioned that Wonderland is celebrating its 11 years this year. So to celebrate this, we're preparing a little architecture camp, or architecture summer camp, which will be at the Architekturzentrum Vienna between August 7th and August 25. And we also hope to actually bring that here next year to Kiev in a way or another. The point is that it's like a summary of what we did in the previous months, previous years actually, the previous decade. So it's going to be a presentation of all the activities we do, a lot of the projects of our members, and most especially it's going to be like a living 24-hour city which is accessible all the time. We have all kinds of activities that help the audience to get closer to contemporary ideas and dilemmas of architecture. Another quite interesting, I guess, an important thing from the past years of Wonderland is a manual that was made for emerging architects, because we thought that it's, at university maybe at some points it may seem to be very obvious that what the architecture profession is, what are the tests, what is the career of what is a typical career for architects. But obviously as people enter the profession it looks more and more diverse and more less and less obvious what are the major steps to do, which are the possible directions, which are the possible strategies in the architecture professions. So we created these several little publications. The first one was called Getting Started, so how to set up an architecture office. The second one was called Going Public, about how to become visible, how to advertise the office. The third one was called Making Mistakes, so how to, which in every practice definitely a moment of mistakes come, and how to get through those problematic periods. So in general it was, as the title says, a manual for emerging architects. And as part of this we were looking at different questions. We made surveys, so the books which are actually available at most of the Wonderland events and also online. The book contains some facts and figures, like statistics about the young architecture offices. Also, we had a lot of experts putting in their inputs. We had experience reports and theoretical contributions. And some of the interesting things that came out that I would like to emphasize is that many of the architects do not work in proper architecture, when we call architecture like pure design, designing buildings, but there's a load of activities related loosely or tightly to architecture, to design. Many of the architects were engaging in journalism, or many of them teaching events, organizing events, doing different kinds of design jobs, still related to architecture, but not necessarily focusing on the act of design. And somehow, based on these informations that we produced, we also started to think and generate a discussion about the future of the profession that definitely, you know, with the crisis, in a lot of professional contexts had to rethink themselves, question their directions taken for granted. So we started generating this question about the future of the architectural profession. And here I would like to refer a little bit to the theoretical dimension of all these questions that has been emerging in the last 10 years when the theory started to talk about the expanded field of architecture, maybe a little bit referring back to the 60s art theory questions about the expanded field of sculpture. So there are more and more research surrounding architecture, and this is why I'm trying to link this to this survey that we did. So there's more and more activities that we may call architecture, but they're not necessarily, you know, reduced or focusing on the act of building, but they're pretty much surrounding the act of building with different kind of activities. I mean here, for example, I can quote Michael Hayes, who talks about architecture as a way of negotiating the real, a specific kind of socially symbolic production whose primary task is the construction of concepts and subject positions rather than the making of things. And I really like the definition of a Croatian architect we had in Budapest a few months, maybe a year ago, visiting, who said that me as an architect, my goal is not necessarily to build buildings, but to create spatial impact, right? To create something, to generate a process that has a spatial impact. And I think it's quite interesting, it's an interesting notion if we want to look at what's following here. Because one of the big projects of Wonderland is a series of workshops that are focusing on vacancy. So what is vacancy? Vacancy is, by definition, when there's a building which is empty, which has been empty for a while, for different of reasons, and there's the market or the government or the municipality, they don't find any functions to use this building for. So with Wonderland, we organize a series of workshops. I can show here that we had one in Amsterdam, one in Mannheim, one in Kaiserslautern, one in Cluj, Romania, one in Paris, Vienna, Budapest, Venice, where we were always focusing on one given situation of vacancy, where we were trying to bring new functions and new uses. And we try to define vacancy as the new beginning the best beginning for new and innovative uses. So why vacancy? Because it may sound a little bit marginal when we think about architecture. There's a lot of empty buildings with a lot of empty apartments which are not in use and not going to be in use in the next years or maybe next 10 years. So there's this willingness to connect these situations, connect supply with demand, or realize that there is a supply somewhere and there is a demand somewhere. And of course, we can raise a lot of questions here about the role of the government or the role of the city. What can they do in these situations? Do they have the right to intervene? But I think, and this is what we're going to see in the next minutes, there are a lot of different ways to conceive this question and to see how, who are the actors that can intervene in these situations. So why do spaces lay vacant? Just a few examples, like these are all examples from Budapest, like on the bottom right side, some office buildings that were built in the last 30 or 40 or 50 years simply no longer correspond to requirements or expectations of today. Offices, or especially like global corporations, are not willing to move into these kinds of spaces. So basically many of them lay empty in all across Europe in very different situations. Another reason can be, like on the left picture, simply legal reasons. There's a lot of moments when there's a long process concerning a building, and this doesn't allow the building to be used in the next years. or simply there are big projects that start at some point, but in reality they don't really start for the next few years. So the whole complex or properties are remaining empty for years. There's also an important role for the mismanagement of public properties. Many governments or municipalities are not really concerned, or they don't have the capacity to deal with their empty building stock. There's the crisis, of course, which limits the purchasing power of people in general, but also the flexibility of businesses. And of course there is also mismanagement of private properties, which often belong to large international real estate development corporations that are very inflexible in the way that they don't really care about one little piece of their building stock. It's a very little part of their income, so they rather want to go for long-term, very sure, very safe contracts. And if there's a few years without anyone using those buildings, it's not a big problem with them. But it's a big problem for the city, right? Because, and this is why we deal with vacancy here, because what are the disadvantages of vacancy in the city? For example, in a street which has almost only empty shops, the less and less people coming, remaining shops will also receive less and less traffic, so the street will slowly die. So there's a chain reaction between businesses. Also, the neighborhood may become more unsafe because less and less people are coming there. And of course, also the properties themselves, they decay because there's nobody to use them, nobody to maintain them. So if you look at all these questions from an urbanistic viewpoint, there's nothing worse than an empty property in the middle of the city. And actually, this is something that we noticed in the past days, that Kiev, there's a lot of empty properties and there's a lot of abandoned constructions, which in the same time, of course, they generate this problem in the city, but also they create the opportunity of what we could do with them. And of course, another reason for all this vacancy is that there's in the past years, before the crisis, there was a very, very large scale speculation with properties. There were a lot of kinds of spaces like shopping centers, office buildings, complexes which were built without necessarily having in mind who's going to use them, without any kind of survey or research about the market that's out there. So just in Budapest, we know that there's over 1 million square meter empty office spaces, and we know that in many cities, and this represents probably around 25–30% of all the office spaces in the city. We know that in Amsterdam, for example, it's about 18% the vacancy rate of offices, and there's already a panic in the city. So there's a lot of discussions about how to use those spaces. There's enormous amount of empty spaces that are there in the city, somehow blocking the normal circulation of city and real estate. Okay, so one of the projects, just to come back to actual activities of the Wonderland, was just an example in Cluj that we did in an industrial neighborhood of Cluj in Romania that we called the Strip. The Strip, which was a large industrial complex, of course, like many other places in Europe and North America, deprived by its industry, and especially with the crisis, it had its small industries and funding schemes destabilized. So there was no more investment in the area at all. It was also an isolated neighborhood in the sense that it wasn't an attractive point at all to use or to develop. But we also looked at, so basically our activity there was to analyze the whole situation and to create, let's say, like a public campaign to show the advantages of this area and how can we link this area with different kinds of other activities which are already in the city. Like here, our strategy was mainly focusing on relationships and connections to the local university, which was situated very nearby, and also with the industries which are situated very nearby, and to create a kind of a intermediate space between universities, like we talk about technical university, and the industries which were using actually the technical engineering capacities to create a kind of an in-between space that is not yet work, but no longer university, is some kind of an in-between space of maybe internship or training where logically situated in the city where people can train themselves further out of university. And also we thought that this is a very exciting surrounding when we saw how, you know, this big industrial area, some parts were slowly, step by step colonized by little businesses and little industries. So it was quite exciting to see how these microeconomies surfaced without any real intervention. So we also proposed to look at this model as something that the city can look at and maybe try to reinforce or multiply in that neighborhood. And of course, there's the issue of fund infrastructures, because there's a lot of, you know, areas that are maybe looking for a new use, but obviously there's no money, there's no real investment around. So you probably know a lot of examples in Europe and North America how, let's say, cultural use was very important in revitalizing empty spaces. Just a few examples we did in the last years. On the top right, it's in Budapest. It's a former medical equipment factory that we turned into a cultural center for 2 years, which was quite a big success in 2004. And it really showed that with virtually no money, no investment, you can use such a space for maybe at least in the seasons where you don't have to heat, but still half of the year you can create a lot of activities with absolutely no money. Bottom right picture shows the architecture foundation I'm part of. When we founded this foundation in 2006, we got into this former warehouse which was empty in years, and it was quite an obvious location for us. It was a very interesting place to, you know, again with a very, very low level of investment, to use this space for, to convert this space into our needs, to colonize this space. And it worked very well until the neighboring museum kind of became a little bit jealous that we had much more public than they did, so they kicked us out. But then we had this third very interesting example in Budapest that opened last September, which is the third floor. It's a very unlikely situation, and if you happen to be in the city, I certainly suggest you to come and visit. It's a third floor of a socialist type department store, which has been empty for the last probably 10-15 years. And this very one floor has been converted into a cultural space with ateliers, with a theater hall, with a cinema room, with even there's a garden, there's different kinds of spaces. And it's quite fabulous because, as you see on the image on the left, you're on the third floor, but you still have a visual access to the second floor where people are shopping. You see the escalator going down. So it's a very interesting hybrid situation, again with a very, very low level of investment. Finishing or going further is that also, as you know, the vacant NL, the Rietveld landscape project, demonstrated, it's quite difficult to know which are the empty buildings. So there's no, you know, it's not written on every building that this is empty. Also, governments and municipalities often have very little knowledge about even the buildings that belong to them, if they're empty or not. So there's a very bad administration of these issues. We're looking at different projects that were very interesting for us, projects of crowdsourcing information. Crowdsourcing is the idea that the crowd has a knowledge that no individual, no centralized organization can have. And it's especially true in an urban situation where everybody knows their own neighborhood much better, or neighborhoods that they're concerned with better. So there's a lot of little hidden specific knowledges of certain buildings or certain areas. So just some projects which we found very, very interesting, like on the left, it was a project 4 years ago by a New York radio station, basically where the crisis started to hit very severely in New York City. Brian Lehrer in this radio, the WNYC radio, he invited all listeners to contribute to a Google map when they see abandoned constructions, like construction sites which are somehow left in half. So listeners created a very interesting map, which was a very important help in shaping a policy later on, which helped turning many of the abandoned luxury constructions into social housing. So this is a huge, of course, this is a huge result, and this was only possible with all this crowdsourced information. That was a very, very strong argument to show how many abandoned construction sites are in the city. And on the right we see it's like a homeless organization mapping out the empty spots of New York, again with huge numbers. So this is what we also started in Budapest and in a lot of other cities like Warsaw, Krakow, Katowice, Brno, Prague, Bratislava, to look at empty buildings, empty properties, to crowd map them, to collect them from different kinds of actors in the city. So I'm going through quickly, but this is our maps website at the moment for Budapest. And the last thing I want to talk about is that we also started to think about ways of administering these empty properties. And again, you may think it's not strictly part of the architecture profession or design, but we believe that it is part of an extended idea of architecture as we look at it today, and we look at the possibilities of the built environment today. And there are a lot of very interesting examples outside, like this one, Haushalten in Leipzig, that we cooperate with on developing models for Eastern Europe as well, which is basically an NGO that was founded over 10 years ago, when Leipzig was a really abandoned city with a lot of empty neighborhoods, a lot of people, when the Berlin Wall came down, a lot of people from the eastern part of Germany, they left to Western Germany, so there were a lot of empty buildings. And this organization started to organize, let's say, a framework to connect owners with potential users, owners who couldn't do anything with the buildings because there was no market for that. There was an abundance of empty spaces, and potential tenants. And the tenants, when they moved in, they contributed with their work and time to renovating these buildings, and in exchange they got a lot of very interesting contracts, like very cheap rent or maybe no rent for a few years. So this is a model which we found very interesting, and we are working on elaborating this as well. And coming back to Wonderland, so we planned this 11th anniversary in Vienna and maybe Berlin this year, but we hope that it can come here as well later on. And also here there are our contacts where you can reach us with any question. And of course we're very open to have offices or groups from Kiev as well in the network, because I think it's a very exciting European level cooperation. So thanks a lot for the attention, and I'm ready to answer any questions.